This video is for AQA A-level business studies, and it's looking at paper 3, and it's looking at the last question on that paper, which is the 24-mark question. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you all the past paper questions from the last 6 or 7 years. So that just gets you thinking about how these questions are phrased, have a look at some of the topics and the concepts that are assessed, and look out for, again, a key theme which is going to be based on this all businesses. Now, what's different to this, though, is that unlike the 25 marker in paper 1, which is, again, really about all businesses, which is a similar theme, in paper 3 you have an insert, and that insert can be really, really helpful with your application. So feel free to pause the video and just have a quick look. There's 3 questions on this slide, and a further 3 questions on this slide. And again, as you can see, what keeps coming up is whether it's all businesses or just businesses, it's about more than just the business that's presented to you in the insert. So this is the level 5 mark scheme descriptor, and just consider what's stated. So I'm going to be showing you key advice from the examiner report soon, and often the remarks directly relate to what students struggle with, which are mentioned on this descriptor. So one example being focus on the key demands of the question is something that the examiner reports have mentioned. I'm going to look at that next. But also the response, it has to be well developed, so the arguments have to have depth and breadth, it has to be precise, showing relevant knowledge and understanding, and it has to make judgments. So I've studied the examiner's reports over the last few years, and these are some of the top tips that I found. I've kind of broken it down into focus, application, and analysis and evaluation. So these are observations from all the centres on previous year's exams, and many of these issues have been repeated, so really pay attention to them to try to avoid them this year. So to begin with, focus has been mentioned many times on these examiner reports. So the best students manage to get grips with the demands of the question. And before you start putting pen to paper, you need to really understand what the question's asking. And that might also require composure during your exam, where you stop and you remind yourself of what the question's asking. Make sure that you've considered specific phrases within the question. So often it's to what extent. It might refer to, is it inevitable? Or the question that I'm going to be looking at is will all businesses be doomed to fail? So again, just pay attention to those key phrases and try to use them within your answers. But remember, the best answers are always on point and they never stray away from the demands of the question. So as I mentioned before, a key theme is the all businesses, and this again has been mentioned a lot of time in past papers, examiner reports. There was one year where the students did really well on this, but often students do not acknowledge all businesses. So of course you have the insert, but that's only one example. And sometimes we have years where students use the business in the insert really well, but then they don't apply it to all businesses. Sometimes students don't even use the insert. So just think about, it's all businesses. One business scenario is not enough, but it will give you application marks. But think about how it applies to other industries, other types of companies. Now remember, application isn't just specific business examples, it can refer to scenarios as well. So it can include real world events, which might impact all businesses, or it might be just kind of business hypothetical scenarios. Obviously, the better you're applying to real world concepts, it's probably going to strengthen your application and help you with level 5. But just make sure that you're addressing all businesses. So key issues regarding analysis and evaluation were, firstly, analysis is too descriptive at times. It needs to be more analytical. Remember what I said before, depth and breadth. Try to avoid any new evaluation points. Avoid repetition. As it states on the slide, it should be unique to your response. So if you are simply repeating previous points, the examiners read it once, they don't want to read it again. Your judgment requires weight. So what should happen is your analysis should flow into your evaluation, and it should naturally do so. And then you should be in a situation where you can give your judgment and you can justify why that argument is more important than your other arguments. So also consider scenarios and business situations where the statement is true, but also situations where the statement is false. So just a reminder of the insert, so many clues in the insert. The insert not only provides you with examples, but you can also consider the opposites to the business and the situations presented within the insert. So that helps you to consider other scenarios. So like a prime example, if one company is just simply national, well, how might it apply to multinational companies? If one company is a PLC, well, what happens if we consider unlimited companies? If one company is operating in a highly price elastic market, well, what happens if it's price inelastic? I mean, of course, it depends on what the question's asking, but think about opposites to the company and the situation in the given scenario. So I'm going to focus on the 2022 question, and that is, without strategic planning, all businesses are doomed to fail. To what extent do you agree with this statement? I think it's a really simple structure. Yes, I agree. No, I disagree. And that's your balance. Now, strategic planning directly refers to 3.10. Other units are still going to be relevant, but if we consider 3.10, just think about all the examples of business concepts that you could refer to. That is showing your technical knowledge and understanding. You might not use all of them, but there might actually be opportunity to refer to all of them. So I've read the question, I know my structure, I've got an idea of where it is in the spec and what concepts I should be looking at. Now I can return to the insert to see if there's any clues. As I said before, so many examples. These are some factors in the case study which relates to why it might not be needed and why you're not destined or doomed, to fail without strategic planning. Then there's, of course, examples as to why it might be needed. But again, just remember, this is one business scenario, so you'll need to consider all businesses. So my first argument is going to relate to strategic drift, and strategic drift, it has so many excellent real business situations. So you can just see from the image, we can talk about BlackBerry, we can talk about Blockbuster, we can talk about Nokia, and I'm going to give you examples of how I do that within my exemplar. But remember, you're not storytelling, you're just using business examples to evidence and drive your analysis. So following on from this, I'm not just going to focus on the threats of the external environment, I'm also going to move on from that and develop it further and just look at the importance of why planning is key and the issues if no strategy is in place with regards to internal weaknesses. And I'm going to use the case study to provide those contextual examples. Now I'm choosing to evaluate throughout. I will address structure at the end of this video, but I think it helps address what it depends upon and it moves away from one business example. So I also think it helps the flow of the response, and I think it will also assist with linking to what my counter argument is going to be. So I've used the phrase depends upon. I think it's absolutely vital to use that. I think it's a really, really key and useful evaluative phrase. And now I've got my counter argument. I've got my balance in terms of why actually I disagree with the statement. So I'm going to consider why it might not be needed for success and why business failure might not care. And I'm going to be focused on more emergent strategies with intuitive decision making. And I'm going to again use the insert as my examples from my application. Then I'm going to support this argument with further consideration of the external environment and as to why sometimes it is almost impossible to plan for. And my application from that is going to be kind of real world events such as the financial crisis and the pandemic. And then I'm going to evaluate this argument. I'm going to reference the importance of contingency planning as still being part of strategic planning, and the strategic mindset of planning can help with obviously crisis management and make you more prepared, which gives you a better chance of survival. I've got a real world example there to kind of back that up where I'm looking at Toyota. So now I'm at my overall judgment. Try to use the language which is stated in the question. So for example, to what extent? Consider the picture that I've added of the scales. Try to add weight to a particular argument. So example, which argument do you believe is the most important and why? But also consider the nuances of the question. So doomed to fail is, first of all, we've got an insert, we've got an example which has been provided to you, which shows that this company is not necessarily failing, and actually they've seen sales growth without strategic planning. So that one example alone proves that this statement is wrong. So that was me just kind of showing you my plan, but this is my exemplar. So I'm going to start off with a definition at the beginning of the answer. It's your choice, you don't have to. It's more of a stylistic consideration, but I think it's suitable to start your response with a quick introduction. It either sets the scene or it just keeps focus on the business concept. So again, feel free to pause the video, but this is my first argument. I use real world business examples in this one. Notice that I'm not storytelling, I'm just simply using it as evidence, and it is based on this strategic drift example. I extend that first argument, so it's still the same argument, but it's bringing in new points to kind of, I suppose, support that first argument. And now I've finished, I can look to evaluate. So again, my evaluation of the argument starts off with, well, this depends upon, but I also use the phrasing in terms of yet the extent. So I'm trying to use the evaluative language that's mentioned within the question. Remember, the depends upon is gold. And this helps the flow and it leads to my counter argument, ensuring balance. So again, I have context of real world events in this. So my counter argument now with this extended point is complete. And again, I'm going to return to the insert for evidence support to help me with this. And now I'm evaluating again. Now, I know this might be hard to do in time conditions, and I know that this is the last question of the paper. You might be running out of time. You might be reading this and thinking, in an ideal world, perfect, but could I do this in an exam? And if that's the case and you are running out of time, perhaps this is the point where you head straight towards your final judgment and you don't worry about this evaluative argument. You have to be strategic. You have to think about what you can do in the time conditions, and you can still use, like, for example, these arguments within your overall judgment. So you might just want to save it to your overall judgment. It's really, really important that you have an overall judgment. The overall judgment is the one that you can clearly signpost to the examiner, that it is clearer for them to see that this is evaluation. So if you want to save it for your overall judgment, again, that's absolutely fine. So again, I've signposted to the examiner throughout my response using language and saying in judgment to the question. I'm pretty much saying to the examiner, give me those 804 marks. So it's worth saying that the examiner report on this particular question did state that too few students focused on the statement, all businesses are doomed to fail within their judgment. So try to, again, mention that the key language. Now, I put some key evaluative points in bold just for you to see. So that was my exemplar. Now to finish the video, I'm just going to give you some final tips based on structure. Right, do not be too hung up on the structure. Yes, you need an organised structure, but it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It is very much dependent on your style, how you prefer to structure, how you've practiced the structure. But just remember, as long as you tackle all the assessment objectives, you can get into a level 5 regardless of what your structure is. Just remain focused on what the question is asking, and the best of luck for your exam.